This presentation is being recorded and will be deposited to the Housatonic Heritage YouTube channel for others to enjoy and learn from. And we'll distribute the link to the recording once we've uploaded it, which should be within a day or two. My name's Dan Bolognani. I'm the Executive Director of the Upper Housatonic Valley National Heritage Area, and pleased to bring you today's presentation entitled Perennials, Pollinators, Permaculture, Planning a Climate Resilient Campus. A couple of housekeeping notes. In addition to recording and posting this to our YouTube channel, we'll also provide this directly to the Berkshire Hills Regional School District Senior Leadership Community and the DENISCO design team that is a consultant working for the school district. If I could ask everybody, while you're not speaking, to mute during the presentation, that would be terrific. The co-sponsors today are Greenagers, one of our great partners here in Berkshire County, and Will Conklin, thank you so much for co-sponsoring today's presentation, as well as the Berkshire Conservation District. They're our community partners, and so pleased to have you both on board for this. And many thanks to Vivian Orlowski, tireless advocate for all things pollinator protecting, and also Housatonic Heritage's program director for Operation Pollination. So thank you, Vivian, for pulling all this together today. I'd like to also include in the record here land acknowledgement that Housatonic Heritage had written with the help of the Stockbridge Muncie Community Band of Mohican Indians. And it reads as follows: the Upper Housatonic Valley National Heritage Area lies within the ancestral homelands of the Mohican Nation. The Mohican ancestors lived on and with this land for more than 10,000 years before the arrival of European colonizers. After enduring a series of forced removals, their descendants are today recognized as the Stockbridge Muncie community. From their reservation in Wisconsin, the community maintains strong connections to their unceded homelands here in the Northeast United States. It is with gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohicans, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge Muncie community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. Further, Housatonic Heritage advocates for informed research and respectful interpretation of the indigenous people who have historically inhabited the lands of the Upper Housatonic River region. We urge others to join us in learning about these important histories, to understand the culture and lifeways of the Mohican Indians, and to respect both their true history and their contemporary lives. To learn more about the Stockbridge Muncie community, you can visit mohican.com. And they're good partners with us in some of our other endeavors here to interpret accurately and historic events that happened here. Today, though, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Eric Toensmeier, and I will read a brief bio and then turn it over to Eric. Eric Toensmeier is an award-winning author whose books include Paradise Lot, Perennial Vegetables, The Carbon Farming Solution, Trees with Edible Leaves, and Edible Forest Gardens with Dave Jack. He ran a seed company, managed an urban farm, served as an appointed lecturer at Yale University, and was part of the team behind the New York Times best-selling book, Drawdown. Eric has also published a number of peer-reviewed science articles. His writings can be found on Patreon. Eric presents and offers courses online and in person. He's been passionate about perennial crops in agroforestry since 1990 And since 2009, he has focused on climate change mitigation in the food system. Eric's consulting clients range from individual farms to NGOs to states and provinces. And his new farm in Southampton, Mass, demonstrates farm-scale agroforestry and ecological home-scale edible landscaping. Eric is fluent in English, Spanish, and botanical Latin. And there's more on his website. We'll take questions throughout today's presentation and answer those that we can get to, so please submit them through the chat function. And as at the end of the presentation, we will text and we'll address all the questions as we're able to within the time limit. So I will turn it over to Eric, and thank you so much for joining us and doing the presentation.
Well, thanks very much for having me, and greetings to my neighbors slightly to the west. Let's see, I will see if I can share my screen over here. Here we go. So I've been asked to cover kind of a range of topics related to ecological landscape design and management. So we'll walk through those, and lots of room and time for questions as we when we get to the end. So let's see. First, in terms of like framing things around what climate resilience is, it's good to begin by looking at what the climate projections are. And I know that you all have had quite a year last year in terms of fire and drought, and we've all been quite aware of flooding recently. So we'll just start by framing with that a little bit here. The projected impacts in the region here, higher temperatures, of course. This is projected impacts of climate change. Interesting changes to rainfall, more overall, but with coming more in intense storms with longer dry periods in between. More flooding, more erosion from wind and water, and more fire. That's certainly all in line with what you all have been experiencing. And if you can look at these little maps up here, you're in the purple zone there, which is 1 to 7 days a year over 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And the projections have you moving to something more like 60 to 90 days a year over 86 degrees Fahrenheit by 2070 to 2099 in a high emissions scenario. So quite a bit more heat is projected, and some of these tools and references I have in some of these slides here can provide lots more detailed information for people who are interested in that. And this is a really interesting website that looks at different climate projections to show where what certain cities might be like in the future. So this is looking at Pittsfield, which is the closest one to where you are that they run analysis for. So in 60 years, in a high emissions scenario, they think that Pittsfield will be like southern Missouri, southeastern Missouri, about 12 degrees warmer and 8% warmer in the summer, and 12 degrees warmer and 24% wetter in the winter. So that's quite a big shift. So the town that's closest to that is Advance, Missouri, and I've been sort of fantasizing that maybe towns might go and set up sort of like a sister city program with some of those other places so they can get a sense of what it is that they might be in for. And while there are some things that we really can't adapt to, a tornado, devastating floods, really catastrophic fires, and so on, there are lots of things that we can adapt to. Like drought, there are a number of strategies for adapting to drought. One is to increase the organic matter in our soils to become more resistant to drought, to increase their water holding capacity. I have a slide about that in a moment. More mulching, catching water off of roofs in tanks and in in-ground structures of various kinds, using more efficient irrigation, replacing water intensive landscaping elements like lawns wherever we can, choosing species that are adapted to drought, and so on. Oh, you know what? I'll just jump ahead one. Here we go. For every 1% that we increase our soil organic matter, which is like the humus, the broken down, dead, formerly living material in our soils, every 1% we can increase that as the percentage of the total soil volume, we gain almost 10,000 gallons per acre of water storage in the soil. So that's the kind of resilience is if we can increase the organic matter in our soils, they can hold more water, and that makes us better able to make it through droughts. It also actually has a nice impact on flood mitigation in that you're sort of catching and holding that water and slowly releasing it as a sponge. So that slows the water heading into our waterways, slows and spreads and sinks the water to help reduce flooding impacts from large storms. Although really that needs to be done at a pretty large scale in order to make a difference. There are also plenty of ways to adapt to intensely increasing heat, like trees to shade our buildings and our children in playgrounds and so on. Um, Parking lots, I do always appreciate some shade in a parking lot. Walkways can be covered with trellises to help keep things cool. There are some plants that we commonly grow in our landscapes here now that are unlikely to be able to handle that kind of heat. One of the ones that I'm sad about is the native black and white spruces. Seem like they're really already at their southern limit of their range right now, and they're not going to be very happy with that kind of heat. Mulching, perennial ground covers, there are other things we can do to help to keep things cool, to prevent bare soil from being exposed and so on. So that's a little bit about resilience, and there are many more aspects of those. There's a whole set of fire planning, um, all of these kinds of challenges, again, except the most extreme ones. There are things we can do to design landscapes that to try and minimize the damage. And many of those practices are already things we do widely, like mulching, for example, but it's sort of a different lens to view these practices that we may already take. They may become of increased importance over time. The kind of species we choose also certainly matter. This is just an example of a couple of species, some native ones and some almost native ones and some not at all native ones that can handle intense heat, that can handle warmer winters and flood and fire. And are one of the interesting challenges is that as things warm up in the winter and then get cold again, the flowers of a number of kinds of trees that we rely on for food are killed. Um, Peaches being especially vulnerable to that. Um, but even right now, you can see it with mini silver maples around where I am here anyway, have started to flower already and have the flowers have been killed back. So late flowering is desirable, resistance to extended drought, resistance to various kinds of wind and storm damage. Um, these may be characteristics that we want to pay more and more attention to in our design work in this period. Flood resistance would be oh yeah, flood resistance is on there too. Sure. So I'm sort of building out some spreadsheets and databases of this kind of information. And there's lots of good resources, including one of the very best is the USDA plants website, which is a great source of information on the tolerances of different plants. So that's a little bit about projected climate changes and some of the kinds of strategies to adapt, some of the kinds of resilience we're looking for. So let's talk about ecological edible landscaping. This photo is my old house first when we began in 2004, and then in I want to say 2021 when we left. So you can see there we did make a pretty big difference in the backyard over there. There was more habitat. There were more birds. There were more some amphibians showed up on their own. Mostly though our insect diversity increased enormously between having lots of flowers available for those insects to use for pollination, for having not spraying pesticides, having some water elements available where they could drink. and having a mixed kind of vegetation with different strata, trees and shrubs and herbs, and sort of a patchy mosaic landscape can provide some really desirable habitat for a lot of those kinds of organisms. And even in a highly urban environment, which is where we were in Holyoke, um, those organisms are there and they'll find their way to you. So on the one hand, I think that the native garden without food is maybe not ecological enough in that we're sort of outsourcing the production of our food somewhere else, usually being grown in a way less ecological than we might be able to do in the home or campus or other site. On the other hand, a food garden without those kinds of habitat elements isn't enough. And I really do feel like landscapes are possible that kind of bring together the best of those two worlds, the best of low maintenance ecological food production and the best of extremely ecological landscaping. And although mine was very wild and woolly, there are lots of examples of this kind of system that are very lovely and ornamental as well. One of the elements that I'm particularly fond of in that kind of a system is the food forest, where we're trying to grow food in a system that is as close to nature as possible, is utilizing the structure and the functions and the diversity and the changes over time of natural systems like forests, producing food, fixing nitrogen, which basically just means making some of its own fertilizer, attracting the beneficial insects that provide some degree of pest control, and also the other kinds of organisms, certain birds and other kinds of organisms that help to manage those pest populations, providing certain habitat elements like dead wood and water, hollow trees eventually that are really critical. And having a strong anchor in native species, maybe not being exclusively native species, but having a number of them, particularly those that have been identified as having especially strong relationships with pollinators, with the kinds of caterpillar larvae and so on that Doug Tallamy has made us also aware of in this last bunch of years. So one element to think about including would be in this case, plants that aren't from here, but that are easy to grow and taste fantastic, like chestnuts and Asian pears and asparagus in this example. Some of the things that we like most to eat are the hardest to grow in an ecological way, like peaches and apples, for example, can be very, very difficult to grow without a lot of very aggressive management. So I like to lean into the lower maintenance things wherever I can. And the other thing I like to think about at schools anyway is having things that will be producing food when the students are actually, when school is in session, when the students are actually on campus. So at my son's old school, they planted a bunch of blueberries, which is great. I think planting blueberries is wonderful, but they were not fruiting when the students were at the school, which is just, they grew a lot of kale, which was great. The kids like that. But I know that schools are used for other things all summer long as well, but as much as possible, could those food benefits be happening when the students are actually on the campus? We have some great native fruits to the Northeast, and I also enjoy doing lists actually by county. You can use the GoBotany website to find out what's native to your county if you really want to drill in. Pawpaws and American persimmons, our native mulberry, are great choices. They tend to be much easier to grow than the kinds of fruits we're used to that have come here from Europe and Asia. Mulberries in particular are very, very popular with kids. Some of the shrubbier berries, and in fact, this is serviceberry in this case, which is widely planted as an ornamental, but happens to be and is a really spectacular ornamental and native, but has really delicious fruit as well. And I do think of berries as something, again, the timing is often not perfect with when kids are around at school, but something that children get really excited about and will eat huge amounts of. Certainly, my own son will eat unspeakable number of pounds of berries over the course of a year. He really enjoys them. And again, many of these are easily grown. Many of them are native. Many of them can handle these kinds of challenges of flooding and drought and other kinds of issues that that we're facing, and many are really, really lovely ornamentals that is certainly something we need to think about in our landscapes as well. And of course, we have lots of great plants to work with that we would plant primarily for pollinators and beneficial insects. Certainly leaning into the native plants here makes lots of sense to me. I think many of them are spectacular ornamentals. And I did publish an article, which is up on my website for free if people are interested, where I looked at, if you have sort of limited space and time and budget, what are the plants that will be valuable to the widest range of pollinators and beneficial insects. So you can see the example here with our native cherries and plums, ranking them for the kinds of bees, native bees and non-native bees that pollinate our crops, other bees, crop protecting wasps and other wasps, the flies and beetles that do pollination. Do they provide nectar for butterflies? Are they an important host for butterflies and moths? Are they valuable to hummingbirds? So of the hundreds of plants that you might choose, I've tried to narrow it down to those that are valuable for a very, very wide range of organisms. And then put together a flowering calendar so you can try and have at least something in that group flowering all through the year. And those are all native plants there in that case as well. Not all of them are a perfect choice for every site, of course. So you know, it's only one of the many factors we would take into account in making a design that one would put into account when making a design. But we do have really some fantastic choices to work with here that are really truly valuable to such a wide range of organisms. Then you might also look at what provides valuable let's say fruits or seeds for birds and other kinds. There's a whole range of benefits that these plants can provide. And when we understand them, not only for their beauty or not only even for food production, but how they what their relationships are in nature, that enables us to try and create landscapes that not only serve the functions we want, but that can provide the greatest value in terms of restoring some degree of ecosystem function. That was a really fun one to write. I really enjoyed that. We have lots of native plants that fix nitrogen to provide some fertility for restoring beat up soils, or just for maintaining a productive landscape. And many of them are extremely beautiful plants and happen to do a nice job for the pollinators and so on as well. I'm a big fan of the desmodiums, the tick trefoils. I think people don't appreciate them perhaps enough for their beauty and their ability to fix nitrogen and their value to pollinators and so on. They do have horrible sticky seeds. That might be one to not plant anywhere near where kids are going to be running around, because they'll come in with seeds stuck all over them after recess. That's not great. So just in terms of the context of what you all are working with and the communities that you're working with, the Mohican communities in Wisconsin that you're working with and so on. I am working on a book right now with a couple of Indigenous folks, with Courtney Lewis, who's a professor, Stephanie Morningstar, who is a plant expert and runs a land trust, Neftali Duran, who's a chef out here where I am, to try and look at what, for the Eastern forest more broadly, really from the coast all the way out to the edge of the prairie, what kinds of things were happening here before colonization in terms of what did care of landscape look like in farming and gardening. And we're doing lots of interviews with contemporary Indigenous people on how those practices continue to this very day. For the group of food plants that we're writing about, we have names in 80 Eastern Indigenous languages. Sorry, 70. 80 plants, 70 languages that we've worked very hard to collect. So broadly speaking, you know, in the region, I don't know much about the Berkshires. I know more about the valley out here where I live, but broadly speaking, a lot of the area was burned, certainly not all of it, but was burned to create this we call productive landscape mosaic, meaning not just one kind of habitat, but a more patchy kind of mosaic of different kinds of habitats in different stages of succession, some more open, some more like thickets, some more like forests, some open trees here and there. to make sure that the kinds of foods and other uses that people wanted were available to them where and when they wanted. Many individual plants, like particularly nice fruit or nut trees, for example, would be cared for and even pruned, um, and otherwise weeded around, things like that. There was a lot of seeding and transplanting of what we would consider today to be wild plants that were actively planted and moved even outside of their native region, seeded after fires, transplanted into new places. There were and very much continue to be in indigenous communities today, a whole suite of practices around sustainable harvest, so that by harvesting, you're actually leaving things in as good or better shape than you found them for harvest for the following year. Lots of mixing of corn, beans, and squash, of course, is the famous combination, the Three Sisters, but there are also lots of other species that were mixed in with corn, beans, and squash, including trees. That's where we talk about agroforestry, in this case, where you're mixing annual crops with trees. It's pretty good evidence of things like mulberries and native mulberries and native plums being mixed in with the annual crops, with food crops. And also very interesting combinations of, let's say, mulberries and plums and persimmons in the vineyards where native grapes were being grown. So we we just set up an Instagram for the project called Eastern Plantways, and which has essentially nothing on it yet, but we'll be putting lots of things out there soon if you'd like to follow on that project. It's been really interesting to work on. We've been at it for a couple of years now, and we should have some things coming out probably early 2027 on that. And let's see, if you're interested in learning more, these are some of the books you might check out. A few by me, but mostly not, to learn more about these kinds of approaches to food production and ecological landscaping. And if you want to see more from me, I've got active on Instagram and Facebook. I have a Perennial Agriculture Institute where I post some of my more scholarly work, and then Perennial Solutions is my general place where I do lots of articles and where I have an announcement of upcoming courses and workshops and things like that. So that is just about our time, I think, there. So we can do some thoughts and questions.
Terrific. Thanks, Eric. There are a couple of questions, comments that came in on chat. Do you have that, or do you want me to read those back for you?
Let's see, I can catch some of them here. Dale asks about human food. I did mean human food, but very many of these are, of course, great food plants for other kinds of organisms as well. In particular, I've been learning lately about plants that are valuable for birds that also eat insects. So thinking about birds as part of our pest control system, and what kinds of, like here at my farm, I'm planting this year a whole lot of bayberry and eastern red cedar, which are really valuable winter foods for some of our omnivorous birds that eat a lot of insects. Yes, the questions about limited time to manage the landscape. What I will say is that not all native plants are easy to grow, and not all perennial plants are native to grow, but it's certainly something you can select for in designing plants and in designing landscapes and selecting species to aim for the lowest maintenance possible. I've also seen some examples where various kinds of community groups sort of pledge to come and care for certain plantings. Obviously, lots of a school needs to be closely mown grass for playing fields and things like that, and that's great. But are there opportunities around the edges, or some corridors in between things that can support some more interesting food for people and ecological functions? And it's certainly possible to make things worse, and I think it's possible to make things easier as well. And again, many of the plants that would already be used in a landscape, that are commonly used in landscaping today, actually have these uses and functions, and we're maybe just not thinking about that as we're planting them. Serviceberry being one of the best examples of that. Um, so many are low maintenance, and I would lean into those. I think also not just the plant choices, but the plantings themselves. A lot of our native pollinator plants, for example, can be mowed once a year, which is a pretty low kind of low level of management for sure. And while some kinds of fruits, again, like your apples and peaches and so on, need lots of pruning and lots of care, other things really require very minimal pruning or no pruning at all, unless a branch breaks in a storm or something. So I think yes, it is possible to address those concerns, and I think they have to be addressed in order for it to be able to work. Um, let's see. Do I do any designing around indigenous annual crops like squash, beans, and corn? Well, I think the main issues with those plants have been worked out thousands of years ago already. So I just try and learn from that as much as I can. Um, I'm still very much a novice in that department. I do think they're great for that combination is really great for teaching gardens and schools. There's so many different things that can be brought out from the kinds of interactions between those plants. And I will say I do like particularly planting squash in the early years of planting, kind of like tree and shrub planting so that you're getting some food from the while you're waiting for those trees to come into bearing. And of course, pumpkins are a very, very popular item with lots of school kids as well. So that could be a good choice. Native plants for cutting down and using as mulch. Sure, let's see. Anything that grows really robustly. So a lot of our warm season grasses are great, like switchgrass and big blue stem. Um, some of the things that grow really tall and robustly, some of our really large flowers like Joe Pye weed, cutleaf coneflower, um, um, what's the other one I'm thinking of there? New York ironweed. These kind of like very large, really robust, thick-stemmed kind of things can be great. And a bunch of our legumes, I think, are a good choice. There are also some of our leguminous herbaceous plants and even some of the woody ones. Nitrogen fixing, I should say. Not all of our nitrogen fixing plants are legumes, and not all of our nitrogen and not all of our legumes fixed nitrogen. Talking about holding mowing till later in spring. I would put ticks very high on the list of things to be concerned about for sure. Um, um, and it really may be where you have different kinds of zones. The play zone, the full nature zone, and the sort of intermediate zones with maybe very tightly mowed pathways in between there. And there are many people who know much more than I about how to make those kinds of school plantings work in ways that are that address ticks and all the other kinds of challenges that one can face there. Um, but again, if this is thinking about some of the edges, and I looked briefly at some of the maps of the school, it does look like there's some places kind of at the borders of the woods and in kind of out of way areas or in wetter areas where these kinds of plantings could not be interfering so much with play space. Some advice from municipal, nonprofits, and other organizations seeking funding. Oh, sure. Let's see. Well, often people are able to get sponsorships from local nurseries and garden centers, who are often thrilled to have to donate some plants to plantings, especially where they can maybe put up a little sign and say that they donated some plants for them. I've certainly had good luck with that over the years. Um, we also were able to receive a number of supplies that way. We also this may or may not be relevant there, but we worked closely with our tech school, um, which has a landscaping training program at the farm that I used to manage. They helped us with all manner of different kinds of projects. We also worked with Job Corps, which was able to do most of the plumbing for us for just the cost of the materials. So there are lots of people out there who do educational programs, who are looking for places to get their students out in the field and practicing things. So if you can provide materials, they're thrilled to do that. Or we at any rate had very good results with that. Let's see, food waste and plant-rich diet as they relate to campus. Okay. Um, uh, if you can manage to set up a composting program at the school, and I'm sure there are all manner of challenges around that other people have worked out that I am not particularly knowledgeable about, but bears come to mind as a key issue in your part of the world. You can certainly reduce the emissions. Food that is wasted that ends up in landfills produces methane, which is very undesirable from a climate change perspective. So if you can capture that food waste and put it to use, turn it into fertile soil, that's great. And plant-rich diets in a climate-friendly campus. The different kinds of foods have really different emissions associated with them, and the more you can get people to lean into more plants and less animal-based protein, particularly from ruminants like cows, whether it's dairy or beef, the better. I know that there are the kinds of budgets and other constraints that uh, 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 school cafeterias and food programs are dealing with are so immense. An interesting story of how we found a little hack for that in my work in Holyoke was that the tech school we were working with wasn't allowed to buy our vegetables and offer them through the school, but they had a culinary program. So we found a grant to buy them a salad bar, and then they purchased vegetables from us as training materials to teach the students in the culinary program how to prepare vegetables for a salad bar and how to serve vegetables in a salad bar. So there are some creative, interesting ways to go for these things. Okay, insights on lands and plant for the sloped land. Well, on sloping land, sometimes it's too steep to mow, and then you clearly want to really let something grow up there. That seems like the kind of place where sort of thicket forming or the kinds of plants that will spread to really fill in, somewhat more aggressive plants to spread to fill in, could be a very good place for those kinds of things. Whether those are thicket forming shrubs that are going to provide food for birds, or they're thicket forming pollinator plants, or spreading pollinator plants. Um, Certainly you can go so far if you have the budget and time to really terrace those and make fantastic, more intensive plantings out of them. But sometimes the easiest thing to do is to plant a bunch of things that will largely be able to take care of themselves and fill in the space and not need so much care. Although someone's always going to have to go in and pull out bittersweet and whatever kinds of plantings we do for the next couple of thousand years here in this part of the world is my general sense about that. Let me just think if there's anything else about funding sources. So there's sort of like the donations component. Um, there certainly are some philanthropic efforts out there that are very supportive of various kinds of school food and farm to school and school garden programs. Again, I'm not up to speed on what's happening in that area, but there is quite a bit of enthusiasm for that kind of stuff. And depending on what happens with federal funding in this coming period, there are some programs through the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, like the Wildlife Habitat Improvement Program, that can be a really good source of funds for that do not need to be for commercial farms. Those can be for any landowner. So that might be an interesting opportunity there as well. I always keep an eye on the Fish and what is it? The Fish and Wildlife Foundation, not the National Wildlife Federation, but the Fish and Wildlife Foundation. From time to time, they have targeted funds available for this region. They don't as of a few weeks ago when I last checked, but we were able for our farm in Holyoke to get $14,000 or $15,000 for plants from them over the course of several years, which actually goes a pretty long way in a landscape of this kind of scale. So we really were able to piece together getting a lot of the materials donated and plants donated, getting a bunch of our labor donated, and a few grants. All of that together was able to go a long way. It just took a lot of active hustling for the fundraising in order to make that really work. And I don't know who all is. I clearly you all have a very active volunteer community, very concerned community, which is great. And that's really what it takes to make that kind of thing happen. Is all of those people. Some people working the grant writing, some people working the different garden centers, and so on, um, to bring that kind of community effort together. And you might start with very small plantings and build. You know, you might start with one bed or one slope or something, and build your way out as you go. Um, and if you all do decide you want to go forward with that, I certainly know some people who do this kind of landscaping work professionally, and I would especially point you to the maybe for some initial studies, the Conway School of Ecological Landscape Design, which is based in Northampton, um, has a very low cost design program where you work with their master's students, and they could do some of the initial stages of this kind of design work at a very, very reasonable price. Um, um, and they're really good at thinking these kind of issues through, at looking at the kind of management concerns, looking at legal issues and setbacks and zoning and grading and runoff from parking lots and all these kinds of issues that really have to be thought about in this kind of integrated design. So I think they might be a great resource to think about inviting in. And again, it is their pricings are very reasonable. Let's see, suggestions for planning on the road for emergency vehicle use. Well, you sure want, is this sort of like a right of way? Certainly something impermeable is going to be easy and low maintenance. That can also be more expensive. If you want to have something that's more permeable, I mean, there are permeable pavers, which are very expensive, or there's having some kind of a surface that would have some vegetation that can be occasionally driven on, um, um, or even just mowing often enough to be able to have them get on there. But you really do want full and best access for those. That's not an area that might be more of a good Conway question. Plantings along the road going back to the greenhouse for service deliveries. Well, I really feel like you can't have too many berries available for public access. Um, yeah, what I would do on this, I know more about this from the fire perspective, is they can tell you, 30 feet all around the building, we need to be able to have access so we can get in there with the truck and actually turn around and back around to do what we need to do and not be interfered with by anything. So someone would want to talk to those folks about exactly what they need, or the Conway people might know already exactly what the specifications are, and you really have to work around that. If that's the core design element, then you say, great, of course we want that, and safety is most important. What can we add into that without like what would be the maximum height? Maybe the visual access is really important. So we don't want to block views for anything over than such and such number of feet high. Those would be the kinds of questions to ask. And then within that, you say, well, what are the good things we can grow that would be less than 3 feet high? Like our dwarf Juneberries would be a great choice there. They're nice and short. They taste fantastic. Low bush blueberries might be a great choice. Gooseberries are very low to the ground as well. That's really only about 2 or 3 feet high as well. So first you sort of come up with what those design criteria are, and then you look at plants that do all the other things you want and meet those needs. And I feel like the more of those constraints you come up with in the design actually makes the design easier because you have less and less options. I feel like having a blank slate requires way too much creativity and insight. But if instead you really clarify what your goals and requirements are and really study the site and understand what its limitations and opportunities are, By the time you lay those two things over each other, you don't have that many options left. So you're ruling out the need for magical creative inspiration and getting down to the very practical business of what can actually work, um, um, given the land you have and the needs that you have. So that's sort of the way I think about that. I don't want to keep you all over, but I'm happy to stay and talk some more if you like.
No, thanks very much, Eric. I appreciate all this, and I guess you've addressed all the comments and questions that have come in. Oh, I think Vivian might have posted one more there, comments about the land bordering Route 7 and low-cost maintenance plantings.
Well, a couple of things there is one, you want to know what the setback is for where you have to be able to make it have emergency access and stuff.
50 feet.
So okay, so it has to be something that meets those requirements. The other thing to think about in roadside plantings is salt tolerance, because we use a lot of road salt around here. So there are lots of our native plants are tolerant of quite a lot of salt. Some things that grow here and also at the coast, for example. So it's possible to select a like little blue stem, for example, grows very nicely with salt. So it's possible to have a very attractive roadside planting that can handle salt and provide some of these other functions we're talking about at the same time.
Thank you.
All good. Yeah, thanks again, Eric. Thanks again to Vivian for pulling this all together. Thanks to our community partners at Greenagers and the Berkshire Conservation District. And as I had mentioned earlier, we will post the recording of today's event to our YouTube channel and send the link around to everybody that responded to the registration. So again, thanks all for joining us today. Eric, any final comments or anything, Vivian, from you?
Well, I appreciate you all having me out today very much, and I appreciate that you're thinking about how to, on the one hand, do the very best you can in terms of a very ecological and perhaps edible landscape at the school, and also really balancing that with practical issues like budget and maintenance and the people who are going to have to actually be out there caring for this. I think that's walking in the door, thinking, asking the right kinds of questions.
Excellent.
Thank you so much. I think I'm reading all the comments that people are writing now in the chat, and many thanks from all of us. This is going to be a big project for our district. It's in Great Barrington, but there are 2 other district towns, and there are many towns that choose Choice Inn for their students to come to high school here. So there are going to be many students, teachers, staff, families impacted by this, plus all of us who come to various events at the high school. The high school has a lot of events for the public. And all of this is also an opportunity for them to learn about land and plants and perennials and pollinators and permaculture. So thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks to everybody who joined us today for the presentation, and hope to see you all again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.